Welcome to First Reading, the Old Testament lectionary podcast for everyone who loves the Bible. My name is Paul Ether, and I am a PhD student in Hebrew Bible Old Testament Studies at Yale University.
And I'm Reverend Dr. Rachel Wren, Assistant Professor of Biblical Studies at Trinity Lutheran Seminary at Capital University. Tim and Rosie are off for this week. Maybe that's why I'm having such a hard time saying my own name. But Paul and I are here. We're here with preaching tips and insights for February 10th, a few weeks to go until Transfiguration Sunday. This passage is a wonderful passage, Paul. You got Genesis 45, 3 through 11, hop skip over to 15. So what did you do with it?
I did some work on it. We'll see whether it's good or not. But it is the passage about Joseph revealing himself to his brothers. It is the last part of Joseph's story, where Joseph tells his brothers who he is. If you remember, preachers, the story of Joseph spans like a ton of chapters. From chapter 37 to chapter 50, it's all about Joseph and Joseph's life. And it does serve as a bridge between the patriarchal narratives of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then the larger story of Exodus, which is yet to come at this point in the passage. Liturgically, if you remember, preachers, it is set during a time of regional famine. So there's crisis, there's no food. Somehow, through lots of obstacles, Joseph ends up in Egypt as the leader in charge of food. Thematically, the story explores, other issues such as dreams, which I'm deeply interested in. God's providence, reconciliation, as I'm sure we'll read about shortly, and to a good extent, something about God's sovereignty that Joseph keeps referencing as the story unfolds. So in Genesis 35, we are close to the end of the story, and Joseph, once again betrayed by his brothers and sold into slavery, like I said, is now the powerful person in Egypt because he's in charge of food, the very scarce commodity of the time.
Yeah.
And his brothers came to Egypt seeking food during famine. They did not know he was the man. That's a very interesting paradox. Apparently, their fate is in the hand of their brother. And this is where the revelation actually goes on. I have always thought about the Joseph story as like a kind of a Hallmark movie. I don't know what you think about that, Rachel.
Well, there's no Christmas tree farm. There's not a dog. And there's nobody drinking hot chocolate. So it can't be a Christmas Hallmark movie, but I could definitely see the markers for just like Hallmark in general. And I think one of the reasons it's kind of a Hallmark-ish movie is because it's a really compelling story. It's got drama. It's got family, intrigue and despair and conflict. And you see that in this chapter itself. It's a kind of too bad that they didn't include verses 1 to 2 because that really sets up. It's where Joseph weeps aloud and he sends everybody away from him. But, right away in verse 3, it just sort of smacks you in the face with the drama of the moment, doesn't it?
It does. It does. And I think that's actually one of the things that I noted as really standing out. This is where he says, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? Then his brothers went mute.
Yeah.
They couldn't recognize him, although they had seen him a few times before. And that's also another Hallmark-y kind of feature for me, because that was not the first time they were seeing their brother. They'd been there before.
Yeah.
And sort of just didn't tell them who he was. He sent them away and, sort of put, things in their bag so that they can come back again. And then they went back and forth a few times before finally revealing it. And they didn't recognize him throughout the whole time. I'm sure they probably thought he was dead at this point. Oh, he was completely lost. But I'm drawn more to the emotion and the profound vulnerability that the passage exudes here, especially on the part of Joseph. But also on the part of his brothers, maybe. The shock, the speechlessness, and perhaps even the shame. We did this to the guy, and now he's the main person here, right?
Have you seen the movie Wicked?
Please.
The one that came out recently?
No, I have not.
Okay. There's a scene for any of my preachers who might want to reference it. The Ozdust ballroom scene has it just in some ways really captures this moment of where harm has been done, deep harm has been done to someone, and they're sort of given the choice of walking away from that other person or kind of accepting the the apology that they give them. And it's just this really kind of powerful, emotionally charged moment. So might be irrelevant,
Mhm.
but I think, you setting this up as a Hallmark movie, Paul, is making me think of like the fact that in some ways this is a love story between Joseph and his brothers. You
Yeah.
know what I mean?
It
And like
is.
that's
It is.
I'd never thought about it that way before. So
Verse 5 even makes it more of a love story because that's where the assurance comes from Joseph to his brothers.
yeah.
Immediately, it's like, do not be distressed or angry with yourselves, for God sent me here to preserve life.
Wow.
Like, Joseph reframes the betrayal as part of God's providential plan,
Yeah.
claiming that God had something to do with this. The repetition of Kelahani Elohim,
Mm.
like God sent me here.
Mm.
And the phrase shifts the narrative from one of human betrayal to divine purpose. That
In-
God worked through the betrayal and his own suffering and his rise to power for a greater purpose. And what that purpose is so worth everything that he had gone through. So therefore, his brothers should not worry at all. I think that's radical.
Yeah.
That's like Job, right?
Yeah.
Well, Job didn't take it this cool.
Yeah.
Job complained for a while.
It's a different Hallmark movie. It's a different Hallmark movie.
It's a different. It is, yeah.
Anything else that struck you about this passage?
Yeah, there's the third thing here, which is in verse 9. God has made me Lord in Egypt.
Mm.
And it could go many ways for sure, but I am struck here by his own recognition of his uplifting.
Yeah.
That God has lifted him up and giving him a chance, and he accepts it as such and knows and now declares it to his brothers. And perhaps this is my chance to also add that from the perspective of migration, moving to a strange land and thriving there is a huge
Yeah.
huge undertaking. It's a very tough thing to do. Remember Joseph's origin stories. He's resold as a boy, kind of worked odd jobs. He went to prison a few times, but his own abilities, one of which is to interpret dreams, and brought him to where he is. In effect, I hear Joseph saying, God has made me somebody important in Egypt. God brought me here, and so go bring my father. Do not delay. Like, do this now.
Yeah.
It is very sad that he was treated the way he was, but the way he recognizes his own uplifting, sort of turns everything down.
Yeah.
In addition to his assurance that he gives to his brothers about not worrying for what happened to him.
In some ways, it reminds me of how when somebody else goes through something hard, I have an opinion about how they should feel about it. You know what I mean? Like, I think they should be angry, or I think they should be sad, or I think they should be da 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 da. And Joseph
Yeah.
chooses, or is led to by God, framing his experience in a way that allows him to really kind of have a sense of agency in it. Like, yes, this thing happened to me, but because of it, God allowed me to use my dream interpretation, food economics, and famine management skills, to become like, right, second guy in Egypt. And I think that looking for agency, especially when you are in the midst of a situation that feels like your power has been taken away from you, is really a gift and an ability to kind of thrive in the midst of a hard time.
Especially in a foreign land,
Yeah. So, okay. So how, this is a great story, but what would you recommend preachers do with it?
I mean, this is one of the very popular passages, and I presume preachers may have some experience preaching this passage, but I just want to highlight a few things that I personally like. If I were to preach, this is what I'll probably do, right? The issue of reconciliation with family.
Yeah.
We see a really good example of how fractured relationships can be restored.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also something about like the tension between human actions and divine sovereignty, where Joseph recognizes both betrayal on the part of his brothers, but also God's work in the midst of all of that.
Yeah.
But still decides to choose and stick with how God's work overrides the disappointment that he feels. And I know that's a difficult thing to do, but it's a good example to follow, I would say. There's something also about Joseph's revelation of his identity and how that resonates with like Epiphany, which is just past, but like something about, it being he revealing himself anew in a different pressing, not just because he's grown and he's like a much more, he's an adult now, not a boy, but also that he's actually been transfigured, professionally. He's in charge of a lot more important things, at least as the narrative would have us believe
Yeah.
for the moment, right? I mean, he's transformed from a boy, from a slave to somebody very influential. But more importantly for me is the topic of food and food supply, right? Provision in the midst of famine. And I think about this in light of a ton of things going on around us. Had referenced like the famine, the fire situation in LA. There's a ton of questions about like migration, who belongs, who doesn't belong, and the implications of that on finding home. And definitely finding home has something to do with what you eat and food and stuff like that. There's also a lot of debate about the food politics in America and what's going on in America, who's controlling food. There's recent interviews going on online and a ton of things going on. But I'm also thinking about places that are actually plagued with literal famine.
Yeah.
Right? There's no food. Like there's war going on in DRC right now, Congo, Gaza, but like the implications of all of that still remain. The South Sudan going on. Only God knows what's going on in Ukraine right now. There's so many places in the world that are literally experiencing some kind of famine. And I think that the passage allows us to think about food supply and, lost family relationships and lost homes, and in how we could think about supplying food for family and for relatives, thinking about the world as this one grand family of people. So that's where my mind is at right now. I don't know where yours is.
No, I think that the moving, from the Hallmark to the real life is a really powerful way to do this story. Because if we leave it in the Hallmark, we leave it in kind of the Disney, we leave it in the everything's rosy, rose-colored glasses, all that kind of stuff. And when you look at this, the reality of this, there's a great article by a scholar who's now named Carolee Cook, but at the time she wrote it, her last name was Folk, Carolee Folk, Focht. And she talks about the trauma of Joseph's story and the way that Joseph's story lifts up traumatized peoples and how they deal with their trauma. So like, as much as this is a kid's story, it's not a kid's story. There's a lot here that can be worked with in a really meaty way. And I think I would invite preachers to try to think through what are some of the meaty things that your congregation is dealing with right now, and how does this story about God's providence, about God's work leading us to agency, about God's work bringing good out of a disastrous situation, how do some of those themes speak to your local community, and as you lifted up, Paul, to the global community as well? So those are some things I kind of see here. But how about pitfalls?
I have one pitfall actually.
Yeah,
it's a small one.
Yeah,
probably a very common one, but I'm leaning into that with my like many years of youth ministry and youth work, which is when something really terrible happens, especially in relationships when we offend each other, we tend to like reduce it and oversimplify the subject of forgiveness.
Oh my gosh, oh my gosh, yes.
Like, well, look at Joseph, forgive and forget.
Yes.
Like, it's not that simple, guys. Their actions, as brothers had real consequences on Joseph's life. In the midst of all of the 20-something chapters that we read, there's like tons of enslavement going on, tons of prison experiences, tons of terrible things that happened to Joseph that I'm sure wouldn't and could have been avoided if their brothers didn't take the actions that they took. It ended up being okay, but everything that came before it's resolved is not just like betrayal for the sake of betrayal. It's real consequences. And so we cannot just reduce the whole message of forgiveness to forgive and forget it. We've had enough of it. We have to like really think about the process of forgiveness and the real consequences that have people emotionally, but also the way to actually practice the outcome of physical lives.
Oh my gosh, I think that is such an important point. I can't tell you the number. And
Hmm.
the fact that you frame this in terms of youth work, I think is really important. The number of conversations I've had with youth who had been preached their entire life a very thin understanding of forgiveness that didn't
Yeah.
allow them to be kind of whole people in the midst of being harmed by
Yeah.
someone else. Like, it's
That's
really
right.
important for us to have a very, very robust teaching around forgiveness that allows people to say, to create boundaries. Forgiveness is not
Yeah.
the dissolution of boundaries. Boundaries are healthy, and
Mhm.
it's the reestablishment of boundaries, which can help actually lead to forgiveness and to healthy reconciliation. So I would 100% co-sign that, Paul. Well done.
Amen to that. Amen.
Well, thanks, Paul. This has been, I mean, it's a great story, and I think you offered just some great nuggets. Well done, Paul.
My pleasure. My pleasure, Rachel.
Well, listeners, we hope this inspires your preaching and teaching this week. And if you did enjoy it, then check out our back episodes on firstreadingpodcast.com. You can reach us over email at firstreadingpodcast@gmail.com. We are on Facebook as well, and we love to hear about your reactions to what we're putting out there. Just as much do we love to hear that people were recommended to our podcast by friends. So if you have friends, and I'm sure you do, invite them to check out First Reading Podcast and see what might be fun for them on there. Thanks very much to Tim McNinch for producing. And until next time, I'm Rachel Wren.
And I'm Paul Hassan. Have a wonderful week preaching.
Why is it always so hard for me to do my credentials, Paul? Why is this so hard for me? Here we go. Hang on. Okay. And I'm Reverend Dr. Rachel Wren, Assistant Professor of Biblical Studies at Trinity Lutheran Seminary at Capital University. Good gravy.
Awesome.
We'll call it good.